Ahora nos gustaría poner un poco en contexto algunos términos. Los vamos a ir soltando poco a poco y lo primero que queríamos preguntar es ¿qué es el contextualismo funcional?
Mhm. So we would like to start by putting some terms into context. So let's do so little by little. The first question is, what is functional contextualism?
Functional contextualism is a modification and extension of radical behaviorism, understood as a pragmatic system. Radical behaviorism is sometimes understood mechanistically, and I think that's a mistake, but many people think that's how it should be approached. Functional contextualism makes clear that this wing of behavioral thinking is radically pragmatic. Mm-hmm. And the core of that idea is that we look holistically as the actions of whole organisms, and we want principles that explain their actions in context, where actions mean everything a person can do. Feeling, thinking, remembering, reasoning, and yes, doing with their bodies. And we want to develop principles that are not just bottom up, but are driven by social need and applied need as well, that allow us to predict and influence those events with high precision, high scope, and with depth across levels of analysis. And those are minor modifications of radical behaviorism, but they're also expressed in ways that I think lead to more understanding.
Sí, el contextualismo funcional está relacionado con una modificación del conductismo radical. En muchos casos se interpreta de forma mecánica, sin embargo, yo pienso que esto es un error, porque hay que explicarlo de otra forma. Se trata de algo pragmático. La idea es que miremos todo de forma holística, que miremos todas las acciones del organismo y lo que buscamos son principios que expliquen las acciones en contexto. Y cuando digo acciones me refiero a todo, lo que sentimos, lo que recordamos, el razonamiento, y queremos desarrollar principios que también se fundamenten en las necesidades sociales. Y queremos buscar la manera de prever también los eventos con mucha precisión gracias a estos principios.
Y el último término que nos gustaría que definiera es qué es interpretar visto desde el punto de vista del contextualismo funcional.
What does it mean to interpret from a functional contextualism point of view?
I missed the first part of the question.
What do you mean by interpreting from a functional contextualism point of view?
Do I mean by interpreting, did you say?
Interpreting, yes.
You mean, how do I mean thinking of this issue in a functional contextual way that we're talking about? Okay. Functional contextualism, because of its unit of the whole organism interacting in and with a context, considered historically, situationally, attempts to deal with the individual in a social context, but in their own terms. That is critical to identifying processes of change that are empowering for people. Mm-hmm. It's mathematically impossible to take normative categories and predict the individual. Very few people know this. The physicists worked this out in the late 1800s and proved it in the early 1900s with a theory called the ergodic theorem, ERGODIC, ergodic. Almost no behavioral scientists know about this, but they should, especially behavioral people, because the functional, contextual, or I could say radical behavioral wing of behavioral thinking has always wanted principles that start with the individual and then can be turned into nomothetic principles only if they help you understand the individual even more. For example, a concept like reinforcement you see with the individual organism in the context of the variability of their behavior over time. The individual is never an error term. But when you do that, see that with the individual, and then another, and you develop principles, now you can look at that individual and say, oh, see there, that's a reinforcement relation. And see there, oh, that too, different kind. And so those concepts are not normative. We don't even have a word for them. I've invented one with my colleague Stefan Hoffman. We're calling them idionomic. And if we're going to escape Galton's eugenic dreams, we have to go back to the individual, but then we have to scale to the nomothetic principle, but only if they help us see the individual even more precisely. And that has to be true with our research designs, with our measurement, with our applied and clinical procedures, with our theories. And that's the larger vision or journey that contextual behavioral science is on. Not just ACT, not just RFT, but this larger attempt to change the analytic unit and the methods that help us understand that.
El contextualismo funcional prueba a abordar directamente el individuo en su contexto social, pero también con sus condiciones. Y es muy importante para buscar procedimientos de cambio que puedan empoderar a las personas. Muchos científicos lo saben. De hecho, ya los físicos en el siglo XVII lo habían entendido, pero solamente mucho después lo demostraron con una teoría. Y los científicos conductuales lo saben. Y también es importante decir que esta doctrina se remonta a algunos principios que parten del individuo. Y solamente después pueden desarrollar algo más, pero solamente si comprenden lo que es el individuo. Por ejemplo, esto se aplica con la teoría de refuerzo. Esos conceptos no son normativos. No existe ni siquiera un término para definirlos. Mi compañero y yo acuñamos un término nuevo, idionómicos, y si queremos superar el sueño eugenético, necesitamos volver al individuo. Y estamos buscando una unidad analítica que nos permita comprender el método analítico.
If I could add, behavior analysts were used to thinking of direct contingencies only, and time series or single case designs worked well for that. We do need single case designs, but once you have relational operants, these operants operate on other behavioral principles. And because of that, we need to start thinking in terms of complex networks, dynamical systems within the individual, never treating people as error terms, looking at variability within the individual to understand how things like fusion or avoidance or values or social, cultural beliefs or reinforcement, how they interact. And yes, genes, epigenes, brain circuits, all of it as a complex system, and then derive principles from that. It's difficult scientific work. high density longitudinal measurement done very well. But in the modern era, it's very possible. We can do this with wearables, biophysiological measures, and yes, self-reports, but done in a high density way that then can treat the individual as an evolving system and then use those principles to apply to others if and only if those principles improve the fit of these models person by person by person. The individual is never an error term. Their truth is what needs to be heard.
Los analistas conductuales se han centrado en las contingencias y han utilizado un diseño de casos únicos que pueden funcionar, pero no siempre, porque tenemos que pensar a nivel de redes complejas, de sistemas dentro del individuo, para comprender cómo la fusión, la evitación, los valores, las creencias sociales y culturales y el refuerzo interactúan entre sí. Y todo esto crea sistemas. Y luego a raíz de esto podemos desarrollar principios. Y en el pasado era un poco más difícil, pero en la época moderna sí que podemos hacerlo con las medidas biofisiológicas, por ejemplo. Podemos tratar al individuo como un sistema que evoluciona.
I could say one more, just one more.
Yes.
And that agenda is best fulfilled, I think, inside an extended evolutionary model that allows you to think in a multidimensional, multi-level way. So that when I say the individual, I don't mean the individual alone and cut off from their socio-cultural background, their history, from their relationships, from their families, from their communities. No. Just as we need to understand the parts of the organism, what's going on in your brain, what's going on with epigenetic regulation of gene systems, to understand the whole person, in the same way, I need to scale that analysis to include couples and families, neighborhoods, communities, and do that in a very precise way. And the only theory that's adequate for such a big agenda, I believe, is evolutionary theory understood in its modern, extended, multidimensional, and multi-level way. And I think that allows us to get all of the life sciences on the same page to do the hardest scientific task that has ever been given to human beings, which is to understand human beings.
Este programa funciona muy bien gracias en un modelo de la evolución que nos permite pensar de forma multidimensional y multinivel. No tenemos que pensar en el individuo como algo en sí solo o fuera de su contexto, de sus relaciones, de su familia, de su comunidad, de su historia. No se trata de esto. De hecho, hay que comprender que las partes del organismo, por ejemplo, lo que pasa en el cerebro, lo que pasa a nivel de los sistemas de genes, son importantes, al igual que un análisis también que tenga en cuenta a las familias, a las comunidades, a los vecinos y a todos estos factores de forma muy exacta. Y solamente hay una teoría que se ajusta a todo esto y es la teoría de la evolución, que funciona de manera multidimensional y multinivel. Y podemos emplear todas las ciencias vivas para comprender el ser humano, una de las tareas más difíciles del ser humano en sí.
De acuerdo.